Hello, everyone. Welcome to yet another episode of Free Lunch. It is an honor to be hosting you every week on our podcasts, and I'm joined by the one and only Mr. Ken Gishinga, or as we're calling him today, or from today, Mr. Kenny G. Mr. Kenny G, take it away. How are you, sir?
Thanks very much, Kim. It's an honor to be in this podcast today. Really beautiful, warm day in Nairobi, and really plenty to unpack in from what has been happening in the economy in Kenya.
Yes, you're totally right. It's been a crazy, crazy whirlwind of a week, and different highs and lows. But Ken, what do you want us to talk about today? Because I can talk about almost anything at this point. It's been just an eventful, crazy time.
Certainly, it's really been a very, very eventful week. I think one of the big talking points has been on the reopening of the flights into and out of both Nairobi Airport and Kisumu Airport. And that came as a relief to many people in the business sector, because that most of the tourist destinations here depend on foreigners coming in, if you think of the Masai Mara. So in a way, it was a sigh of relief, but still there were some people who were also really concerned about the infection rates. There is no social distancing in these flights. And we'll talk more about that. But I just wanted to get, what was your first on August 1st?
Right. So I think for me, August 1st was Happy New Month was the first thing. I was like, oh, thank God July is over. It's been too eventful to mention. But yes, I was excited August 1st. I was reflecting. It seemed like August 1st was also the anniversary of a dispatch of peacocks that the Tanzanian government gave to Kenya. So I thought that was quite interesting, quite nice. But, to the topic at hand, it was great that the airlines finally opened. And I think for me, it was a signal. It was Kenya signaling to the world that we're open for business. It was Kenya saying to the world that, yes, we might not necessarily have everything figured out, and I'm happy to get into some of those issues. But we're here. We're still surviving. We want to try and move forward with the rest of the world. Kenya was also playing catch up. A few other African countries had already opened before. So it was great to finally have East Africa's largest economy also say, you know what, we're open, right? We're open for business. So that was great. And I think as a signal to the international community that activity is back on track. And I like also what you said. For the business community, it was also a sigh of relief, because ideally, hopefully, this would be allowing the country to catch up on lost gains on tourism, potentially have international travelers from certain countries where COVID was less of a problem to come in and, do business, go to the coast, go to Masai Mara, and, and help show up local tourism. And also revive our national airline, which has been struggling, as early as March. And so happy to get into that conversation as well, because there's certainly a lot that, this reopening means for us as a country in terms of our national pride, but also the business environment.
Excellent. And even before we airline, there's just the whole mechanics of flying that has been coming up. And one of the talking points that became a bit controversial was, some people are saying, we don't have social distancing in the flights, but you have social distancing in matatus. It's almost as if two different rules for two different sets of people. I think one of the rebuttals that came up from the airline officials, they were saying that, if you think about the cabin pressure in the air cabin, apparently it has a way of really regulating the airflow. So much so that even if people sat sort of next to each other without the 1.5 meter rule, the flow of air in the cabin has been structured to be able to facilitate very good flow of air and minimize any flow of infections. Did you buy that argument?
It's a tricky one, and of course, I'm no health expert, so let me give that disclaimer right off the bat, and also realize that this virus. There's a reason we're calling it the novel coronavirus. It is so new that we're learning every day, every single day, what works, what doesn't. To your question, I find the whole premise a little problematic. I agree that we have social distancing in public transport vehicles, but not in the airlines. What's going on? And I know in the initial discussions, IATA had been thinking about what does social distancing look like in a plane. And the concern was, if you tell people to sit on every other seat, that would, raise the economics of air travel and make it more unsustainable, especially for an industry that's already, looking to lose about $84 billion this year. So that was just going to make airline travel a bit more costly than it needed to be. But the question of whether the airflow in the cabin is such that COVID is less likely to circulate, I don't know. I worry about that because I remember the KQ pilot who lost his life after he had done a run to an area that was heavily infected with the virus. And of course, it's unclear, did he pick the virus in the plane? Did he pick the virus while he was in transit? Did he pick the virus while on layover? So I think there's a lot there that needs to be figured out. And my bigger problem is, even aside from the flight, everything around taking an international flight now. So you have to get a certificate of that shows you're negative. You go to the airport early. There's advanced screening and checking. You have to have your face masks and gloves and these sorts of things. When you get into the plane, I'm assuming even as part of the check-in process, they're taking your temperature. And I think that's what my first problem begins with all of this, is that, the main indicator we're using is temperature. And yet we know fever is not the only indicator. So you can have chills, you can have general fatigue, you can have a dry cough, you can have diarrhea, you can have vomiting, nausea. All of these things you can't quite detect. And so you're very likely to onboard people into a plane who are symptomatic but still carriers of COVID. And then, one thing that came up as part of those guidelines, Ken, was if somebody, so you're in the same plane, you were all okay, maybe you are not symptomatic at all, but if thereafter you're tested positive, there's a likelihood that you and the people who are sitting around you might need to go into quarantine, right? So then that also sort of says that the guidelines aren't full. We still aren't quite sure of what's going on and what to make of this virus.
Yeah, I really like how you drew our memory to the KQ pilot. I remember that was Captain Daudi Kibati, and that a hero. And you're right. I think he made some flights to New York and back, and contracted it. But to your point, I mean, it's also hard to say, was it in flight? Was it at the airport? Was it at the hotel? He was staying. And in a way, that kind of, if it's in flight, as you say, it debunks that argument. And I also know British Airways had a couple of casualties, especially during the repatriation stage of the flight. So there is good evidence maybe to contest that argument. I really feel the economics really weighed heavily. In as much as governments do not want to admit it, I think really the economics behind the scenes, because so many people, our whole tourism sector depends on these flights, our whole hospitality sector, our importing, our exporting depends on this. So I feel the economics was so profound, but I think to be able to put those concerns to rest, I think that's the narrative they had to give. But I really feel behind the scenes, it was really the economics that made it impossible to do social distancing around there. And definitely it was opportunity for our local airline carrier KQ to come in. But even before COVID, Kenya Airways over the last 5 years has reported significant losses. I think At
Yeah.
some point, it reported the largest corporate loss in Kenyan history.
Yeah.
So even before COVID, there were struggles, and even right now, as we speak, it's really facing their. I think they plan to lay off about 650 employees,
Yeah.
and many other airlines are also struggling in this. What's your immediate outlook on Fast KQ and aviation in Kenya?
No, it's difficult times. I like the way you've segued to KQ, our national airline, and I think from something else you said before, I think the economics just made it untenable to continue a regime of no international flights. And then when I think of what other airlines were doing, so Emirates, I believe, was offering insurance. So if per whatever reason you land in your point of destination, you are found COVID positive, Emirates was looking to give you extra insurance to just make sure that you can be covered in quarantine. And so, it's great to see some big brands like Emirates being able to think through what next. And I think, like you're saying, KQ's unfortunate position even before COVID meant that even if there was some interest, or if that idea had sparked across people's minds, there's such limited headroom, there's such limited reserves that there's no, they wouldn't be able to, feasibly do it. And when you talked about the sort of like the job shedding, it's funny. So I was trying to do the math. They were looking to try and save about 1.5 million a week, $1.5 million a week in staff costs by shedding about 40% of their staff. And when you look at the math, like even just before COVID hit, right, they were doing about $20 million in revenue every week. And so because of COVID, that shrunk to $3 million in revenue per week. So that is a humongous change, right? It's like it's a crazy reduction, and that sort of led them to making about $7.45 million in losses. So even when they were looking to cut staff, so if you think of, okay, if we're going to shed staff to try and make this thing work, even at the same level, they wouldn't generate enough profit from making this cost, this change, this staff cost, to actually making it to moving the needle in any significant way. So currently, before the headcount cut, they were making about, the profit was about $9.55 million. If they then actually ended up instituting the cuts, they'd come up to about $10.05 million. So that 5% increase is not going to help too much. When you look at the amount that they owed suppliers up to March, it was around 220 million. So if you said, okay, we're going to resume with lower headcount, and then we're going to use this extra revenue, this extra profit to try and pay down suppliers, it would take 440 weeks just to catch up with where they were in March. So not even counting April, May, June, July, and hopefully, and even beyond, right? Because they certainly have credit terms with their suppliers. So it seems clear that our local airline industry is in a bit of trouble. They're certainly facing very heavy headwinds, and it seems no wonder we are having conversations about nationalizing the airline again. So taking it back to being run by the government. And happy to hear your thoughts on that. But I think there are no easy answers. I think it was a shame that when KQ sort of began to think about re-strategizing and opening up new lines, and the maiden flight to New York, all of these were exciting, but the realities of COVID and shutdowns, just literally, put a nail in the coffin of an industry that was already or an airline or business that was already struggling. So it sort of remains to be seen if the national airline, through government support, can pay back suppliers, because that $220 million is missing in the economy, right? So when we talk about liquidity, when we're talking about MSMEs not having revenue, not having ability to support their businesses, part of this could be this $220 million that's just not been injected back. So if that can be released and we have a bit of liquidity and the engine can move around. But I think more needs to be looked at when it comes to KQ and what's really in the offing. I think, of course, being an outsider and looking in, I think staff headcounts, seem to be the easiest way to try and get things to balance. I am not sure whether that actually works for the brand in terms of building equity and resilience and resonance with customers.
I love that revenue analysis that you provided, and I've actually been thinking quite a bit about the revenue side of KQ, and you're right when you say it has taken a beating. And just listening to an interview by Michael Joseph last Friday, and he talked about KQ having a load factor of about 60%. That's really what you'd say, like 60, the occupancy rate would be about 60% per flight. And it shows you that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done to be able to take those load factors to about 70, 80%. And KQ has been criticized for really having extremely many destinations, some of which have load factors even below 50%. So I think if they can really start on prioritizing their routes right now, really look at areas where they can have maximum load factor, but also advantage, I think that can really be an area where they can really be able to boost that revenue line to something they need to do. I think on the broader conversation you alluded to about the structure, the ownership structure of KQ and really what that means for profitability. And if you really think about, take it back, to 1996, when the whole move towards privatizing had begun. And remember, prior to that, there was a big emphasis on privatization that was being pushed by the World Bank of this world. So KQ was actually the first in Africa, to be able to start privatizing. And I always say there are incredible efficiencies that come when you privatize some of these entities. And I like how they were able to find public-private partnership, in the sense that government still has a stake in it, and private sector still has a stake in it. I think the beauty of that structure is you're able to enjoy the private sector efficiencies and insights, and you'll still have sufficient government support inside. And I think, companies such as Safaricom, which Michael Joseph also chairs, they enjoy that, government and private sector feel. So for me, I've never really been convinced about the whole totally nationalizing wave. I've read about it, but for me, when I think about the most profitable airlines, the American Airlines, it's a fully listed company, on the New York Stock Exchange. So for me, the fact that we are going towards the nationalizing, I almost feel like we are sliding backwards, and we are going to start having inefficiencies that come with the public to a pure national performance. Even though they keep saying that this won't be your typical government entity, because they're going to put it under a holding company that will be able to run it for a certain number of period. But I'm still not convinced, that the current structure as it is I still find it optimal. I think it works very well for Safaricom, if you ask me. And I think we can still make it work. So for me, I think it's really about, look at the routes. Are we Project Mawingu really sort of had all these incredible routes? But I think really trying to look at, because KQ makes good revenue, I think it's the expenditures that really drag it down. And I think if you can cut some of these unnecessary routes where you have 10, 15 competitors, and really focus on the ones where you're almost possibly the only one, on those routes. So you can have significant. The elasticity is not as high in terms of pricing. So I think for me, it's more of a strategic route, in as much as the narrative is being played out that it's more of a ownership structure route. I think it's still more of a pure strategy.
I think I like what you're saying, and I think the thing that I wish KQ would also think about is how have other airlines sort of survived and thrived through competition? Because certainly I imagine every route has a fair level of competition. I imagine, I reflect back on folks like Emirates who, are equally competing in, some very competitive business line, freight lines. But one thing that they're able to do very well is to, when they started, they had an ethos around focusing on how do you create a brand, how do you create an entity that is aspirational, that people want to travel to, how do you create the world's best business class airline? And so they really focused on, this is going to be our differentiator, we'll be best in class. So when I think about these routes, and yes, some might be more expensive than others, some might be more, difficult to manage, but can they command a premium in some sort of way? Can they charge more, or can they offer, better quality of service? I'm just trying to think of the nationalist in me. And yes, I would love to fly the national airline even to Rwanda or to somewhere else. But if my ticket price, and maybe even let's say those are the most competitive, or those are the least competitive routes, and they have few options. But if the ticket price is not commensurate to the value that the airline is offering for that route, it then becomes difficult for a consumer to make that choice. But when I think of, what else can they do? Can they get, either can they charge more? Can they offer greater value-added services? Can they improve the customer experience, reduce delay times and layovers and these sorts of things? Can they create more attraction and loyalty and resonance for the brand? Because I think of our telcos, and you mentioned Safaricom. Some of our telcos are not necessarily known to be the cheapest, right? The customer complaints every day is that all these options are really expensive, it's unclear, it's not transparent. Yet some of the same telcos command market share of, excess of 90%, and, continue and to be thought of as being dominant and exercising, a significant amount of market share and market power. But the funny thing is, people still use these brands because they appreciate the reliability, the quality, the clarity. They appreciate the consistency of the brand, and they appreciate the fact that the brand is doing more and is being more visible in the day-to-day lives of, ordinary citizens. So I think, fundamentally, yes, there needs to be a price review, route review. There needs to be, some further discussions on how the different people within the organization are interacting between the labor unions and the pilots and the other staff. But fundamentally, I think it's a value proposition question. And I think what it seems to be saying when you look at other industries is, if you can provide a more compelling value proposition, then guess what? Your customers will be willing to pay a premium. But if your value proposition is weak to begin with, even the little you have will be called into question. And I think, sadly, there's an opportunity for our national airline and other brands to think about how strong and convincing is that value proposition.
I love that discussion on value proposition, and it really ties off into brand equity, which I know is a subject you're very passionate about, especially when you start unpacking what are the variables that go into value proposition.
Right.
Obviously, there's experience, there's cost, there's, as you say, resonance, and there's a lot in there. And I think when I really think about the flight from Nairobi to New York, I thought that was really a game changer, because the value proposition was very real, because prior to that, for you to go to the United States, you had to go through either Dubai or the UK or someplace in Europe.
Yeah.
And you'd have to spend so much extra time. Sometimes you might even have to have layover costs in those countries. And I knew somebody who loved Emirates going to the States because it was so seamless. But when that route between Nairobi and KQ opened up, they really jumped on it, because we're saying for you to, have dinner in Nairobi and breakfast in New York, that was it was unparalleled. I mean, no other flight could provide that. And I remember Michael Joseph saying the plan for that particular route was to break even in the space of maybe 1 year. And I think it broke even in 8 months.
Wow.
Just to show you the power of what you're saying about value proposition. So I think for me, if the KQ strategy team can really go and really unpack what are the other value propositions, what are these other routes that there's heavy traffic but there's no direct connection. Maybe those could be the next big thing, but it's really tied to value, because people are really ready to pay extra for value. What are your parting thoughts?
Very good question. I think really excited that the airlines are open. I know there's a lot more that needs to be thought through in terms of how do you keep people safe? How do you keep people engaged? How do you ensure that there'll still be reasonable public health care for folks who are traveling and for the resident populations? I'm excited to see if it'll help at all to rejuvenate the airlines of dwindling fortunes. And I think I'm really looking forward to KQ stepping up and saying, we want to revamp our value proposition. We know we've not had necessarily the best relationship with our customers. Let's change that. Let's repivot that. Let's recenter. Let's refresh it, because anyone can understand and appreciate that they've struggled, they've gone through challenges. Innate in us is the idea of fighting and championing the cause of the underdog. So I think Kenyans will be really excited to say, how do we support this airline? And even not just Kenyans, we are a regional and national carrier for some countries as well across the continent. So how do we also engage those countries to say, hey, how do we make this an experience that's enjoyable and exciting for you guys as well? So I think, KQ has and airlines have a huge role to play in Kenya's recovery. And I'm just excited to see if in this time when everyone's looking at their purse strings, when everyone's looking for superior quality, if the brand can rise up to the challenge and resonate with customers and really show forth what it can do. I think we've clipped the wings of the national airline, and it's now time to let the bird free and let it soar, and let's see what they can bring. What are your parting thoughts?
Excellent. It's really time to soar. I love that phrase. And it's about creating value and really connecting that value with the aspirations of Kenya and of Africa. I love the tagline, the pride of Africa. And I think that's something that we need to build on, this incredible competition coming up in the region. There's Ethiopian Airlines that's really working on its fleet. We know Qatar is working on partnership with Rwandan Airlines, building a whole new airport in Kigali. So the next 5 years will be extremely competitive. But I love that tag of the pride of Africa. If they can select a few value propositions and not too many, just pick a couple and really execute on them. Really, really execute and be consistent. I think there'll be a major loyalty to it. So I think that's it from my side, unless there's something else from your side, Kim.
No, that's it. Thank you very much, everyone, for being such attentive audiences in the past and through this. Happy to hear your comments, feedback. Let us know what you think. And yes, we are looking forward to talking to you guys real soon. Ken, parting thoughts? Anything to tell folks as we head off?
Yeah, feel free to share your thoughts on our social media handle. I know this particular topic has been interesting to quite a number of people out there. So feel free to tell us whether you agree with our views, disagree, what's the way forward according to you, and let's open this public conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Ken. Thank you, everyone. Have yourselves a lovely rest of the day and take care of yourselves.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye.